Teyvat, a fantasy world where the 7 elements flow and converge. As we've had more and more regions added over the years, Teyvat's trade routes have started to become quite confusing. While we have some routes that seem just fine, there are others that don't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And I mean, that in itself does make sense in a way, as in, when it comes to open world games, especially, the developers only go so far to make what is essentially a bite-sized world for it to seem like it's lived in, has its own trade and economy, even more so for a game that has to release a new patch every 6 weeks. But when you lift that veil and take a closer look, you see how trade is kind of lacking within the world itself. In this video, we will be not only looking at Teyvat's trade routes to try and make sense of them, but also its less than savory side, trade violations, scams, all of it. As a certified trade inspector, it's only right that I put a stop to these as well along the way. So come and join me as we try to make sense of Teyvat's trade. And our first port of call will be Wangshuin, a crucial spot for Liyue's economy. Ever since 4.4 came out and released Chenyu Vale, this one has really bugged me. You're telling me that all of Liyue's trade with Fontaine goes through here? And not only trade, but NPCs in general go through Chenyu Vale to get to Fontaine and Lumadus Harbour. That's the only way they can travel there. But how exactly, you ask? Well, it all starts out strong enough. You're an NPC, and you've headed from Liyue Harbour to the inn as your first stop. A pit stop where you can rest at an inn with apparently no actual rooms, or sit down and enjoy some food. And after that, we head down to the docks below. Now, for starters, Wangshuin's docks at least seem a lot more plausible in coming across as though they're actually being used. They're fairly big, have multiple boats and piers, probably not as impressive as a main transportation port should be, but it's not bad, though they only seem to have one worker. But they're advanced enough to at least have cranes to help with cargo. Oh, my guy is just floating. He's actually just levitating. Impressive. I like how the lamps are themed as well. They match the aesthetic of the dock, and they actually do seem to make sense. You can see where the rope is coming from and how it's meant to work, compared to these ones over here that I don't even know how is that rope, like how does that even work? Like what is the rope attached to exactly? And what do we have here, Sounding really suspicious. Yeah, no true child of Mondstadt would make that mistake. You are really not helping your case, sir. You don't even know the innkeeper's name.
This could be an obstacle for Pantalone.
Maybe don't state your plans out loud. I'm sorry, but you've been cool. So we've established the inn as a key point in transporting goods between Liyue and Chenyu Vale. So if our NPC just heads down now along the river where the boats will be going back and forth, then you end up here. This one tiny dock right here. How exactly is this meant to be where all of Chenyu Vale's trade and tourism comes and goes through? Not to mention, before we get any further, this guy mentions that they also transport goods from here to Qingce village on the other side. So where exactly is that dock? Not only that, but there's not even a safe way to get down to the shore here. And there's treasure hoarders right over there. Or is the implication that they transport it all the way to Wangshuin first and then transport it by land back? That seems a bit counterintuitive. Wait a minute, ma'am. Don't you think your prices are a bit extortionate? I can see a whole load of glazed lilies all over town. What's stopping me from just picking my own? Now, would this be considered scamming? Well, seeing as you have a monopoly on the glazed lily market and your pricing is incredibly predatory, probably? I might have to have a word with the Qixing to conduct a full investigation on this. Back to the docks. While the acknowledgement at least of Qingce village is good, this dock is still too problematic, simply for the fact that it's way too small. This is the only way for an NPC to get to Chenyu Vale too. Everywhere else is inaccessible. Everyone apparently relies on this single lone dock for all their trade. For an entire nation? And it feels extra surreal when you compare it to Yilong Wharf. So while the transport agency mainly helps merchants transport goods, they also do fast delivery, presumably for much lighter items, like a Teyvat Uber, similar to what Kirara does. And it sounds at least like Liyue's government is at least trying to make things easier. Now if they would just put some more resources toward this dock too. You guys are the ones in charge of construction and road management? Ooh, well I can't say I'm very impressed with that then. Your roads are a mess. You said it yourself. Roads, bridges, waterways, docks are critical to transporting goods. You might want to look into that dock near the village. Yeah, you really do. If Lumadus is the more popular harbour, why then was this one not prioritised when constructing the aquabus routes? I mean, look how prosperous Yilong Wharf is. It even has its own cultural export with tea. What exactly does Beta Harbour have? As this guy says, the vast quantity of trade goes through here, and they're struggling to keep up with the sheer amount of trade and cargo because the port is just too small. But what I find even more confusing is how trade gets to and from the city. For one thing, there's no connection from Fontaine City to the land underneath, meaning if an NPC from the city, say, wanted to go by foot to this village here, or to Poisson over here, they would have to first take an aquabus route out of the city and work their way over from there. The only indication I can find of a tradeway into the city is perhaps here. This area seems to indicate it could be the main port where trade is dropped off, but there's not a person in sight, just a lot of out of control mechs. Plus, it doesn't even seem to actually go anywhere, so I'm genuinely confused, as it's made clear the aquabus routes are for everyday NPCs and not transporting goods, since the harbours have separate sections here where ships get lifted up and come out of to then sail along the water to their destinations. There's nowhere else that ships could drop off goods to the city other than this spot, at least that I could find. And of course, we have Beta Harbour itself. What is there to say really? It's a bit of a mess. The unsafe route to get there, how the roads are completely unconnected, the multiple abandoned carriages and tigers. As for the harbour itself, it definitely feels underdeveloped, yet this is where Fontaine chose to place more resources. Did you really just reveal your plan to scam people to a random stranger? Well, what? No, I'm actually an inspector, so I will do the complete opposite of that. Yeah, so turns out one of the merchants down at the
Welcome to Beta Harbor, good strangers.
One of the merchants down at the docks is scamming people. You're conducting inspections? Yeah, conduct an inspection on that guy. You didn't think this place would be as busy as Port Ormos. Either way, there's no clear way for trade to get from Beta Harbour to the city. We'll just have to go through here and hope our NPC doesn't get mauled by a tiger or Aranara or something. Ignoring this whole mess of an area, while there is some evidence that trade does go through here, we're going to take a look at Sumeru's main source of trade, Port Ormos and Sumeru City's trade route connection. Sumeru uses what seems to be maritime waterways, just like Liyue does, in order to navigate along and transport both people and goods. It's clearly meant for boats of quite small dimensions as opposed to the ships we see at Port Ormos, or any other big harbour for that matter. I'm sorry, but how the hell is that big ass boat supposed to fit through there? A waterway needs to meet certain criteria in order to be navigable. For one, it needs to be safe and not at all dangerous. These waterways are littered with just cargo and garbage floating all over the place. That is a huge hazard. Waterways also, of course, need to be navigable for ships or boats to get through, so they can't be too shallow or thin, and boats as such also need to be made to work alongside this. These parts along Vimara village seem way too shallow and narrow for a boat larger than this to be able to pass through, while some of Sumeru's boats are designed with the waterway in mind. Again, some of them don't really seem like they would make sense. Rito Island, the trade centre of Inazuma. And Inazuma has most certainly had its fair share of trade issues, that's for sure. Right down to closed borders and a corrupt commission extorting traders. But I want to see how Rito Island is doing now that Inazuma is repairing its trading relations with other nations. Not off to a great start. I've already found a secret tunnel that is surely being used to smuggle items and contraband. Is this fertilizer actually any better than normal, or are you just trying to scam people? As far as I'm aware, there's never been any proof that it works. That's a bit suspicious, sir. Ma'am, I'm not sure you can be charging this much for these seeds. I know they're cultural exports that have come all the way from Mondstadt, but considering you're the only Mondstadt merchant here, that's a bit questionable. And look, this guy is from Watatsumi, and he's not charging nearly as much for his island's own unique exports. Speaking of Inazuma's other islands, what confuses me the most when it comes to Inazuma is that it only really has one proper harbour for the entire region. They need somewhere for trade goods to go, and Kanazuka doesn't even have have a dock at all. Tatarasuna, for instance, prior to its issues, seems essentially to have been an entire town's worth of people, yet it has no means of receiving goods from the main island. And since Watatsumi Island is basically its own entity, the docks really should be more developed, because they do have their own trade routes and networks, it seems. Like, what is this? As for Mondstadt's trade situation, its connection with Liyue is by far the simplest one. Though, as far as Dawnman Port is concerned, there's a guy in Yilong Wharf that sheds a bit of light on more of Mondstadt's trade connections. As he indicates, water transportation for trade seems to be a lot more worth it for merchants as opposed to land trade. However, the way he describes these routes suggests that Dawnman Port is unreachable from the Fontaine side, as he has to go back through to the inn and head from Liyue. At the same time, he also says how the way from the inn to Mondstadt is dangerous if you go the land route, but it seems like the safest route you could ask for in a world such as Teyvat. Besides, doesn't Liyue have the transport agency exactly for these kinds of things? And however you look at it, prior to the monsters being here, this seems to have been a really popular route, so... Now, I'm sure I've only probably scratched the surface when it comes to trade in Teyvat, but it's still certainly interesting taking a closer look at these kinds of things that are often overlooked. The game has a lot of NPCs that kind of tell you about Teyvat's trade and explain it, but then you look at the fine print and see that other aspects of showing its economy and trade don't have as much detail put into them. It's interesting to see where the devs decide to place most of their effort into building the world, that it's ultimately inevitable you're gonna get parts that aren't as fleshed out. Oh, sir? Do you have a trade permit in order to be selling this?